Are you recording this now as well?
I will, yeah. Here we go. Welcome, everybody. Today we're doing another webinar, Dakota and I, that is. And if you're just coming in, make sure you introduce yourself in the chat window, whether you're on YouTube or on the Zoom webinar platform. Let us know your name, where you're coming from, and what you're hoping to get out of today's call. While we're waiting for you guys to let us know where you're calling in from and what you're interested in, Dakota and I are going to start having a conversation about some interesting topics that we thought you guys would find interesting. But we're basically doing an open Q&A session at this point, and you can ask us any questions. So I'm just going to start by introducing Dakota. If this is your first time signing in, Dakota Cohen is a great friend of mine. He co-consults with me, he co-teaches with us as well. And basically, Dakota's a third-generation farmer that's grown up in central Alberta and has come all the way, their family's come all the way from conventional to organic, then to beyond organic. He raises incredible pork in central Alberta, has some incredible pork genetics for people that are looking to get into, outdoor hogs. And yeah, thanks for being on the show today, Dakota.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rob Avis. My wife and I run Birch Permaculture, which is our education company and adaptive habitat. We design resilient homes, acreages, and farms. And both of us are engineers. And so we come at kind of permaculture, engineering, and resilience from kind of a very holistic approach. So some people have called us the permaculture engineers. So today I thought we'd talk a little bit about some of the interesting stuff that I've been seeing out in the news, which kind of affects both you and I, but also a lot of people that would prescribe to kind of this way of thought, I guess, is the best way of putting it. So I don't know, did you see that article, Dakota, about the nutrient collapse that is being talked all over the place?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's several kind of veins that people are looking at nutrients kind of worldwide, whether that's peak phosphorus or the steady decline in the nutrient density of our food. But the latest article is specifically talking about the lack of minerals and nutrient density in some of our crops.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, the premise behind the article is that there's a massive decline in nutrient availability in food that has been observed empirically over the last 50 years. And this latest article, I think, is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, they're drawing this conclusion between increased CO2 level and the nutrient density. And the premise is, or the theory, I guess, that's being proposed is that as CO2 has increased, they've actually noticed an increase in the level of photosynthesis or photosynthesis of plants, essentially. So plants are actually growing faster. They're producing more carbohydrates as a result of the increased food in the air. Most people don't realize it, but CO2 is actually one of the primary food sources of plants. And so the idea is that, what the scientist is proposing is that they are thinking that with all this additional CO2, the plants are essentially replacing the micronutrients that would have been there with macronutrients like carbohydrates. And so that's the first interesting thing. The second interesting thing is, for me anyways, is whenever I see articles like this hitting the mainstream, and like people actually starting to talk about the nutrient declines, which has been known for quite a while. But I would say that it's mostly being discussed within the bubbles that you and I hang around with. People that would, and I hate to say this because it sounds like kind of snobby, but like people that would call themselves conventional thinkers, or people that would be within conventional bubbles who don't really think that there's anything wrong with the food system. This hasn't really been on their radar. And I think this article is really kind of showing that it is entering into their sphere of influence, entering onto their radar. And that's the most interesting part of the article.
Mm-hmm. I just put the link up on the Zoom chat window there. If you want to go and check out the article for yourself, Rob, if you want to throw that one over onto YouTube as well there, folks to take a peek at that.
Yeah, totally.
It looks like we've got a question here on the Zoom platform from Patsy. She's wondering, Dakota, where did you get the minnows for the pond you dug? So this is the species that we're farming are starting to farm now are called Fathead Minnows, is their kind of common name. And they are, just going to write that down here, Fathead Minnows. And they are probably one of the most common species of bait fish in North America. We actually just got them from a local friend of ours here. He used to run a U-fish operation just on Highway 21, a very successful U-fish. He'd make like $500 a day from people just stopping on the highway and grabbing some trout out of his pond. But he stocked his, he had 2 trout ponds side by side. They're about 1 million gallon dugouts each. And he stocked one of them with minnows and one without, just to kind of do a little experiment. And he actually has sticklebacks in the one pond as well, but I'm mainly after the fathead minnows. But you can get them pretty well anywhere, any little creek or lake, they would have them. Just be really careful. According to the fishing legislation in Alberta, it's illegal to transport fish or to possess a live fish more than 5 meters away from the edge of a water body. And I'm kind of incriminating myself here, but they're native fish. They actually live in the water bodies downstream from us, and so in the spring flows, they could just as easily swim back upstream as well. And I'm not. I feel like it's not a real problem, but again, fathead minnows, you can get them from most spots, and just be aware of the local regulations in your area. And but the reason why we're so interested in this species of minnows is because of their ability to tolerate low oxygen environments. They can live in very muddy, dirty waters. And because they breed so rapidly, I think one breeding pair of fathead minnows can have upwards of like 100,000 babies a year. They only live for 2 years, and after they reach sexual maturity, they die on their second year. And they breed kind of year round. And because of their mating habits, and the males actually look after the babies, the eggs, they guard them, but they do it kind of communally. So like the males will territorially guard the nest area of their eggs, but as soon as a stronger male comes along, and he can basically take over that nest. And so there's this constant kind of cycle of stronger and stronger males that come through to guard this nest of eggs, and the eggs keep growing and growing and growing. So they're a very successful fish to have, and they're edible. We've done some trials where we've caught some of the 1-year-old fish that are about 2 to 3 inches long, and you can eat the entire fish, like bones and all, and it's basically our version of sardines. So we're looking at doing salting, drying, different things like that, and I believe it's going to be a very sustainable source of protein that's very low in the trophic level, and basically you could grow anywhere, which kind of throws into one of the other things that we were going to talk about as well. I don't know if you do want to go into that, Rob, or
Yeah, let's do it.
there's also another question here from Lorraine as well. But do you want to kind of finish that thought, or should we just focus on questions? What do you think?
Yeah, let me just go into the Q&A here. This next question is actually a really interesting one. It ties a lot into some of the stuff you're working through right now, specifically transitioning farms, and one of the areas of interest that you're really interested in. So actually, do you mind if I just start this one off and then I'll let you finish it, because you'll have some.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So farming's at a really interesting stage right now. And
you want to say the question, Rob?
Oh yeah, thanks, Dakota. So the question was, Dakota, what are your thoughts on the family farm and the future? So that's a really good and loaded question. And farming is kind of at a really interesting stage right now in a number of ways. And it's being, in some ways, attacked from multiple angles. But inevitably, whenever an attack occurs, there's always opportunity in the attack that takes some creativity and some optimism to see. I was on a podcast last night and we were talking about my thoughts around meat grown on Petri dishes, which is the latest thing, the latest, I don't even know what to call it, sustainability thing that humans are looking at. And so how to grow meat without growing meat, essentially. And so that would be kind of one of the attack vectors, trying to make meat less bad. But that's a whole other conversation with regards to what makes meat bad versus not bad. Number two, the cost of land is going through the roof. And so that makes it really challenging, both from a transition perspective. So how is the next generation going to purchase it? But also it makes it very difficult for new entrants to get into farming. And then lastly, there's some very interesting trends around, it's like finally the medical community has woken up and is starting to look at things much more holistically. So instead of looking at things from a triage or emergency perspective, we're starting to get new types of doctors emerging in the system that refer to themselves as doctors of functional medicine. And so these are folks that are actually taking an approach similar to what farm veterinarians would have taken or take. And that approach is basically looking at the problem more holistically in terms of cause and effect, and not dealing with symptoms and actually going straight to the cause. And the reason that veterinarians, I should say, have generally taken a more holistic approach to animal health and nutrition is that farmers generally don't have the money to spend on expensive pharmaceuticals. And so a lot of work had to go into, both empirically and also through direct research, with regards to why animals were getting sick. And so this emergence of functional medicine is creating a brand new area of research approaching human nutrition and health and disease in the same way that these veterinarians have been doing for a long time, which has really opened up the opportunity around new farmers to come in, because what these functional medicine doctors are really prescribing is food that's grown without herbicides, without chemicals, without pesticides, grown on grass, grown outside in the sun, in the wind, with temperature variations, as opposed to inside of a factory without sun. And what I'm really realizing and I live in a city, and it's wonderful to have this relationship with Dakota because we can kind of talk about the urban context versus the rural context, is what I'm really seeing is that there is going to be a shortage of grass-fed meat within a couple of years. The ketogenic diet and the paleo diets have both taken off, and they're in an exponential growth pattern right now. And there literally is not enough Dakotas or Cohens, Dakota's family name, out there to meet the demand that's emerging. And what that's going to mean is that within a few years, a pig that might cost $1,200 right now, like a pig that you put into your pork, basically, a whole pork, which might cost you $1,200 right now, could very easily go to $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in a few years from now, because there's just not enough supply. And as with any trend, as that price starts to go up, new people will be able to enter into the market, and there'll be new products available. So I actually think that farming is at an all-time low. And I think it's actually a place that we can celebrate because everything has to go through its own cycle. And so because it's at its low, it means it can only go in one direction. And Dakota can talk a little bit about some of the statistics that kind of prove that it's at an all-time low. So Dakota, why don't you give me your 2 cents on it?
Yeah, for sure. So I definitely see, Rob has really changed my perception on kind of the future of farming. I would very honestly say that I was pretty pessimistic before I met Rob about the future of the family farm and kind of the future of agriculture. And I didn't really see a clear path forward about how how we can rehabilitate the living systems of this planet while being able to raise a family and doing this stuff. My parents have been farming organically for 30 years now, but my dad's always worked off farm, and things were not easy growing up. My parents did an incredible job. They raised 6 kids, basically growing all the food themselves. However, it was, money was the biggest struggle for us. And while they never told me, you shouldn't be a farmer or anything like that, it was just kind of assumed that if you wanted to have any quality of life and not work, 16 hours a day and have nothing to show for it, you would just go and get a job somewhere else. And so kind of just by default, I went and got my journeyman ticket and had a good job in the construction industry working for my brothers. And it was at that time that I kind of noticed the importance of food and the strong lack of examples of how to do it profitably and in ways that it was accessible for other people to do it. So that was kind of what brought me back. And just a bit of some background on where we're sitting at in terms of the family farm. So in Canada right now, a friend of Robin and myself, her name's Dana Penrith. She works for an organization called Young Agrarians. And a couple of years ago, they did a nationwide survey of kind of the farming demographic to take a look at what exactly the family farm looks like. And basically, what they found is, I believe it's like over, I think it's 65% around there. 65% of the farmers in Canada right now are over the age of retirement, and I think it's 75% or more are planning on transitioning their land within the next 10 years. So basically what that means is, all of our entire food system is dependent on, people who are about to retire. And there's about to be the biggest land transfer in history since they opened up, the Midwest, via the kind of the land acts and things like that. So, I see all these things coming together, all the resources and information about the lack of nutrients in our current food system, the information about our degrading ecosystem processes and all the negative consequences our current form of food production is having, the fact that the older generations are on their way out, and there's nobody else to kind of take it up except for the next generation. So I really see that there is a huge potential for some massive changes to be made within the next 10 years. However, I haven't seen a lot of strategic plans or kind of broad views of how to handle this strategically. And Young Agrarians is, I would say, probably the best organization that I'm aware of that's thinking about this issue holistically. And they, Dana, as well as the organizers in BC, are very much in the alignment of permaculture and kind of holistic thinking. But there's a lot of other issues around this kind of next transition of agriculture, and I would say probably one of the biggest ones is just how to legally transfer land to the next generation. And because a lot of even if it's in family, there's a lot of legal restrictions around that. And especially if it's outside of family, it's even more difficult. And so there really needs to be some processes or frameworks about how to do that without, and while maintaining everybody's quality of life, and not doing it in a way where the land has to pay for itself over and over and over again. Because I feel that's how we got to this place in the first place, is this, the debt-based money system that we live in is one of the major factors of the reason the land is exploited. I don't believe that farmers are bad people, and they're just trying to raise a family and pay their bills. So it's kind of there's a lot of factors here, but there's huge potential. And right now, my parents and my partner and myself are trying to figure out what our succession is going to look like. So we're looking at, land trust. We're looking at, what are they called there? The stuff that Ducks Unlimited does.
Nature Conservancy?
Yeah, conservancies, things like that, or even starting non-for-profits that purchase the land. Like, we're looking at trying to figure out all the different options that are ahead of us, and how to do it in a way that makes sense. But just for example, our friend Dana, she gets calls daily from farmers who are looking at trying to find somebody, some young farmer who's interested in farming, that's ready to come and take over their land, because either they have no kids or their kids aren't interested in farming. But there's no really process to do that, because in our area, a quarter section is $800,000. And that's just bare land, no fences, no buildings, no anything, no power. And I mean, you can't go to a bank and get a loan for $800,000 unless you have some kind of collateral. And I don't know if this is the right place to talk about it, but Rob and Michelle have been looking at purchasing an acreage or even raw land, and it's extremely difficult for people, even who are relatively financially secure, to purchase raw land. There's a lot of challenges around that. So I don't know. We kind of laid out some of the factors that are involved here. If there's any more specific questions kind of on any one of those lines, I'd be happy to answer that. But I feel like that's a good.
Yeah, I think one of the main things is that farming for the last, for sure, 50 years has been very commodity focused. And so that instantly puts you into a spiral death trap coming from all sides. And it also, I think, gives a false sense of the productivity of the land as well. False in the sense that, the land can be far more productive than just a wheat field if we look at more than just a single product or yield. And so the future of farming, in my opinion, if we were going to choose a model to go after, and of course, any prediction that I make is almost guaranteed to be wrong because there's an unlimited number of possibilities. But the model that I think will slowly start to emerge is a subset of individuals will start to, and I mean, we're seeing this in our own business, start to realize that you don't need 160 acres or 320 acres or 1,000 acres to run a productive ecosystem, which is really what a permaculture-based farm actually is. And in order to make 11 acres pay in the same way that 160 acres pays for itself, you just have to get a lot more creative. So that's the first thing. So smaller farms are going to should emerge as a result of demands for unique products like either pasture raised animals or I mean, we could go through all the different products that are possible. There's an unlimited number of them. The other interesting thing is looking at some alternative models. And there's two models that kind of come to mind. And this is where creativity is really important. Whenever you have massive, massive organizations, and I know this from experience because my parents ran a cake factory. We were one of the families or businesses that was subject to the wrath of Walmart. And as a result, went bankrupt because of it. But whenever a Walmart emerges, whether that's Monsanto or Bayer or any of these massive, massive companies that are just trying to fulfill their shareholder agreement, which is to become more profitable and stamp out the competition, that's just their mandate. there always are small niches that emerge that they're unable to fill. And so the minute that, for example, Monsanto goes into grass-finished pork, you know, I just can't imagine a day. Would have to be very desperate because they're on a totally different scale. And so while agriculture has largely moved into the commodity kind of realm, these massive commodities and the overall lack of real choice, and I'm not talking about the 3,000 different products that can be made with corn, soy, and canola, but I'm actually talking about real food, has made, I think, the family farm is emerging. What's emerging is that the family farm is actually going to become more viable, but it requires creativity. So the other model that I think is really interesting is examples like Blush Lane Organics here in Calgary, or the Farm Box in Canmore. And so you can basically build a business that you know will work today, which is what Blush Lane is. Blush Lane is a high-end organic food store. And what they did was they made a profitable grocery store in excuse me, in the high-end parts of Calgary. And then they used the cash flow from that business to vertically integrate and go out and buy farmland so that they could go and acquire the products directly and have control over the production process. So if we're going to have small farms into the future, we're going to need farmers that, and this is kind of ironic because farming is already one of the most complex jobs in the world, because you're dealing with a production cycle that's entirely dependent on rain, sun, and a host of other biological components that don't run like gears and motors. They run on their own schedule, dependent on the rotation of the sun and all sorts of other things that we have no control over. But unfortunately, farmers are going to have to add a little bit more complexity to their role, which means they may have to shrink their farm down and control more of the sales process from start to finish, and get really creative with marketing. I mean, we've never had access to the marketing tools that we have now with the internet and stuff. So I actually feel very optimistic about what that future might look like. It's going to take a lot of creativity. We're going to have to turn these problems into opportunities. And it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be exciting.
Mm-hmm. And just kind of on that vein, just to finish it off here, is like for any, if there's any young people who are wondering, how do I get into agriculture? What should I do? Should I go, intern on a farm? What's that process? And the more that I think about it, the first thing that I would do is get trained in marketing. The most valuable thing that you can have in this kind of changing, farm, the future of the family farm is to be well versed in how to run a business that's regenerative. And Rob and Javin actually have a coaching process. And if I was starting over, myself, that's the first program that I would take. I would educate myself on how to market and structure a business and have value propositions and do market research with the same lens that I look at ecosystems. That's going to be so valuable, and then you have something that you can bring to the table to if you want access to land, go find an older farming couple who don't have kids via the Young Agrarians and say, look, I have background in marketing, and I'm going to create a company, for a limited liability company or whatever, and I will buy all of the stuff that your farm's currently producing that you're currently selling to the auction market. I'll buy all of it from you at a set price. That's that makes them super happy, and then you start your own marketing company and you take care of all their problems. But in the process, you have some other work agreement where you're starting to get shares in their land or something else. And, you can totally transform their quality of life, but it allows you to bring something to the table that they will never, they'll never be able to learn how to use, the incredible tools that we have available to us just because, it's not part of their generation. And in the meantime, once you have your systems figured out, then you can go and learn how to, grow grass and all the things that they already know. But that's basically what I'm doing on my farm for my parents. Is I've come in with a limited understanding of marketing, and that's growing all the time. But I basically handle all of the business systems for that, and it's a fantastic relationship. Sorry about that, folks.
The phone just wants to put in a bit of music. That's all.
That's me. Anyways, yeah, I've got two more questions here. One's for you, Rob, if you don't have anything.
Sure. Yeah, so the next question is, what determines optimal use in solar panels? So I think specifically they're asking, how do you determine if they're still going to produce in cloudy weather and angles to the sun? So you got a couple of questions in that one question. So first off, the sun, even when it's overcast, still puts out diffuse radiation. And depending on the thickness and type of cloud will determine the amount of photons basically coming through the clouds, which will then dictate how effective your solar panels are going to be. And so there's two main types of solar panels. There's thermal panels, so panels that collect these photons and heat water up. And then there's another type of panels, which are photovoltaics, which use those same photons to push electrons through a wire. And so they both benefit from both diffuse and direct radiation, although I will say that solar thermal panels generally collect a larger percentage of sun than solar photovoltaics. So thermal are the ones that collect the water, photovoltaics to electricity. So that's the first thing. So even in a cloudy day, you're still going to get sun. It might only be about 20 to 30% of what you typically get on a full sun type day. But it's still power that you can use. One of the things I love about solar, especially if the systems are set up properly, is that you can set up very inexpensively feedback mechanisms. And so these are little control panels or dashboards that you can place in strategic parts of your house. So maybe you have a little dashboard near your shower that tells you the amount of thermal energy that you've got in your domestic solar thermal system. And so you can start to adjust your livelihood or how you live within your home based on the cycles of energy that you're collecting via the sun. And so in order to compensate for these sunny and cloudy days, again, depending on your ecosystem, there's a variety of other strategies that you can employ. And I'm going to first speak about thermal here, and then we'll move to photovoltaic. So in the cloudy parts of the winter with a solar thermal system, maybe you're collecting thermal energy for domestic hot water or for space heating. We couple that with other forms of renewable energy like biomass or wood heating, or we can use electric backup heating, or we can actually use fossil fuel if we need to. And so you get that consistent year-round supply of hot water. But ultimately, like a well-designed solar thermal system will almost eliminate all of the energy that you need to import onto your site for running your site. Now with photovoltaics, they obviously, like I say, suffer from the same consequences as solar thermal systems with regards to the diffuse radiation. However, they're producing a much more valuable fuel in the sense that electricity costs generally quite a bit more than thermal energy. Now, because solar electric panels are a little bit more flexible, and so you can basically do things with them that you might not normally do with solar thermal panels, and you can actually have seasonal setbacks. And so it's very simple to put a hinge on the bottom of a solar panel and change its angle dependent on where the sun angle is in the sky for a specific time of the year. Now, I should state that I am not a fan of solar trackers. It's really, really important. I think solar trackers are generally a waste of money. It's cheaper to take the moving parts, specifically moving parts that are running on motors, out of the system and just add a few more panels. Solar photovoltaic panels are awesome because they're solid state, which means that there's no moving parts in them whatsoever. But putting on a seasonal setback on a simple hinge that you manage once or 3 times a year can dramatically impact the amount of collection that you're capable of doing just with a small adjustment. So depending on where you are on the planet is going to depend on what your optimal angle is. And then depending on the amount of diffuse radiation that you receive over the winter months may determine how many additional solar panels you put onto your system in order to compensate for that reduction in production. Hopefully that answers your question. If you want additional specific details about solar photovoltaic or solar thermal, by all means, post another question in the Q&A. If you're on YouTube and you have any specific questions about permaculture, renewable energy, farming, anything at all, just throw it up there. We'll happily answer it. And if not, we'll get on to the next question. So the next one is Lorraine. Thank you for your thoughts. Would you be able to record this so that our family members can hear it? Absolutely. Yeah. So actually it's going up onto YouTube and it'll stay up there after this Q&A session. And we'll make sure that you guys get the link for it. Okay, so the next question is, I had a friend that built a net zero house for 10% more than a normal house. Solar was on top of that. What is your experience with the cost, short-term and long-term? So the person that asked it has a name of toolc_000. So toolc_000, you can do incredible amounts with very limited amounts of resources. So generally speaking, a net zero house, if you can start from the beginning, will be either 10% more, maybe a little bit more depending on the details that you choose inside of it. But just if you don't go to net zero, if you don't go to passive house, you can get a large percentage of the way there just by orienting your house to south. You can get a large percentage of the way there just by optimizing where the windows are placed on the house. And then removing some of the lipstick from the house. This is a really simple thing to do. So lipstick are things like really high-end kitchens or, special appliances and stuff. You can always add those things to your house later and invest in the things that are really hard to change later, like insulation and windows. Long-term costs, I think the long-term costs overall of net zero and passive house are actually going to go down as more people adopt it. But when you're building one of these houses, you're really building something that's going to last for multiple generations. And I think that's really important to understand. We generally, as a society, invest in infrastructure. I mean, I was in Saskatchewan not that long ago, talking with a client who's a civil engineer, and he was telling me that some of the houses that are being built now, in these new subdivisions are literally being built with a 15-year lifespan in mind. And I just can't understand that mentality. I mean, we're talking about building infrastructure that's $300,000 to $700,000 with a 15-year lifespan. And so it's super important, in my opinion, that we reverse these sentiments and these biases, and we look at how we can create efficiencies so that people can just build this as a general practice, so that these buildings are not being torn down in 15 years and put back up with new cardboard boxes. I mean, we're not going to have enough forests to keep rebuilding the houses. The real opportunity that I see in the whole building industry is in retrofitting. And it's the one that's probably going to be the hardest. It's probably going to have the most opportunity in the next 10, 15 years as thermal energy becomes more expensive. I think it's going to be one of the most rewarding industries, just because you have to really be able to think outside of the box to figure out how you're going to retrofit existing homes. I don't think there's enough resources out there to build a new house for everybody anymore. So we can use the passive solar ideas, we can retrofit with renewable energy, and we can pretty much do deep energy retrofits on existing infrastructure with a lot of success. So thanks for the question, Dan. Do you want to hit the next one there, Dakota?
Yeah, absolutely. So the next one is from Anonymous. They're asking, could you speak to the use of buffalo berries? I mentioned them in a previous talk. That I think, is it still up, Rob? The one on gardening with livestock?
Yeah, it is actually. Yep.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so folks want to go back to kind of see where that came from. Looking for information about buffalo berries, good resources on them. Are they good for erosion control, health benefits, planting, harvesting, how to dry for tea, and would sea buckthorn be similar? Okay, so first off, the species that I'm talking about here is called silver buffalo berry, or the Latin name is Shepherdea argentea. I just threw the name in there in the chat window on Zoom. It's really important because there's two species. One of them is called just buffalo berry, and the Latin name is Shepherdea canadensis. That variety has some medicinal benefits as well, but it's not the species I'm talking about. It's completely different. The berries are not edible. it also has some merit. But so for now, I'll talk about the silver buffalo berry. So some good resources on them. Rob, you might have to throw some of these up there. My internet's really weak right now, and if I try to do a Google search, it drains my my internet right now. So
Sure.
Alberta Agriculture has some great resources about silver buffalo berry. They were the main propagators for quite a few years through the Shelter Belt program. It has all kinds of recommendations on, spacing, pruning techniques, where they're best suited for planting and things like that. That's a really good one. In terms of where to purchase them now, treetime.ca sells them in bulk or in bundles of 10. I think they're about $2 a piece. There's another program. The website's the Alberta Shelter Belt program, although it's not the Alberta Shelter Belt program anymore. It's just a different for-profit company that now sells them. Rob has the link up there now. They also sell some of the plant, the seedlings that you can get there. As far as erosion control, I would say yes, they're a great species for windbreaks because they only get to about 12 to 20 feet tall. They're kind of a multi-stem shrub. They do sucker readily via roots. So again, placing them around gardens or any tilled area that you don't want them to spread vigorously, just be really careful about that placement of them, because any kind of disturbance or damage to the roots, it's essentially like a big quack grass. It'll just sucker and spread and go from there. But they do have really good root systems that would hold it down. And because they're a dense shrub, they will help slow the wind down. And they're generally incorporated into field shelter belts as one of the 2 rows.
You still there, Dakota? Looks like your internet froze a little bit there. While we're waiting for Dakota, I just want to touch a little bit more on Dan's question about what's my experience with cost, both short and long term, with regards to renewable energy. I didn't really answer that. So if you think about our context here in Alberta and most of the prairies in Canada for that matter, there is an incredible amount of solar energy available. Solar energy is, streams from the sun in a volume that we can't even begin to contemplate. And we're working on a farm right now where we're actually going to be proposing a fairly large solar array. And it's crazy. I mean, you think about every farm right now requires the importation of diesel fuel in order to run their tractors and all the farm equipment. And we're literally getting to a place now where farmers can actually farm solar energy. John Deere just announced that they're going to be releasing a battery-powered tractor here in the next year or two. And so that will literally change the equation for farmers, being able to self-supply with their own fuel that they can literally harvest using solar energy processes right off their own farm. I think solar is the best investment, both thermal and electric right now, because you know that you're always going to need heat and you know that you're always going to need electricity. And if those systems are designed correctly, you can ensure that they'll run regardless of whether the grid is up or down. And Dan, who asked this question, went through the massive floods in a couple of years ago here in Alberta. And what those floods should have taught us is that the grids that we depend on are actually less resilient than we think that they are. And so I like to think about all the grids that I depend on and design and develop systems that will allow me to be resilient to maybe not massive collapses, but dose-dependent collapses or dose-dependent obstructions or changes to the state of those specific grids. So solar, in my opinion, is a no-brainer. The systems that we tend to design right now are generally leaning towards what we call grid hybrid systems, which are quite a bit more expensive. But these are systems that allow you to put solar on the roof, feed back into the grid, and then have a backup battery bank that will kick into gear. So if the grid ever goes down, essentially what occurs is a transfer switch fires off, which then disconnects you and makes you into an island. And then you're able to use both the solar power coming in real time, plus batteries and or a generator if you've got one on site. So the principle with any kind of renewable energy system is ostensibly to reduce the demand as much as possible, which comes back down to making sure that you have efficient appliances and lights inside of your house, and then moving towards renovating or building a house that uses a fraction of the energy. So one of the houses that recently just went up in the last couple of years from a client of ours is so energy efficient that it uses about 12,000 BTUs of energy, peak heat loss, in the middle of winter, which is almost nothing. I mean, that's about what one burner on your stove puts out, you know, compared to a typical house, which will use anywhere from 100 to 200,000 BTUs. I think the big problem is that people just don't realize how much a gigajoule of energy is, or how much a BTU of energy is, because they're very obscure quantities. And so it makes it really difficult to convince people to actually transition their home to using less energy. Okay, so that answers that question. I had a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about today, and I'm interested, if there are any questions out there, by all means, post them up on the Q&A session. I'm happy to answer them. Anything relating to renewable energy, food production, rainwater harvesting, swales, rain gardens, I mean, whatever you've been dying to ask, by all means, throw it up there, and I'm happy to address it. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think preppers aren't crazy. And so essentially, we get a lot of people hiring our consulting services, and a lot of people coming to our courses that are concerned about the state of the world. And there's really kind of two sets of people out there. There's people that think preppers are crazy, and then there's preppers. And preppers think that the people that think that they're crazy are actually the crazy ones. And so I think it's important to kind of understand why preppers think that the way that they do. And I mean, I'd be interested, how many people here think that some of the grids that you depend on, whether it's water, electricity, gas, are less than resilient? And if so, which grids are you most concerned about? So you can just type it into the chat window, or you can type it into the Q&A session. And if you're on YouTube, by all means, put it into the comment section below. Yeah, heat and electricity. I agree with you. And heat's an interesting one, Silvana, because, yeah, Marie says the aging electrical system. So what's really interesting, and as an engineer, the thing that concerns me most is actually heat, because most of our heat systems require both electricity and natural gas, or electricity and propane. And so there is, that's a system that I would say is not very resilient. It requires both fuels to be functioning at a high degree of resilience in order to operate. And so one of the main reasons that I am a proponent of highly energy efficient homes is that a home that's properly insulated, even in my climate, which will get down to -40, and I use that number, it doesn't happen very often, but I use that number because that's the crossover between Fahrenheit and Celsius. It gets really cold here. So as long as we have sun, even when it gets really cold, the chances of that house actually going below zero are pretty limited. And so having an energy efficient home means that you don't need a lot of additional heat to stop it from freezing. And then just a little bit more, you can actually bring it back up to 21 degrees Celsius. The electrical system, you're absolutely right, is aging. And it's interesting because we're in a funny place in history right now where we're all starting to invest, large percentage of people are starting to put photovoltaic systems onto their roofs, which in the long run is probably going to add to the resilience of the system. But in the short term, it's actually creating all sorts of spikes in energy on the grid when energy is not necessarily required. And so I think in the long run, as battery technology starts to improve and we start seeing more people installing batteries onto their homes, batteries themselves, or decentralized battery installations on people's homes and on people's homes. And let me just bring Dakota back in here, guys. Sorry, I just saw that he, there we go. We're going to start to see that the energy system is going to be far more resilient as more of this infrastructure gets placed into people's homes. So I think long-term, the electricity system looks like it's going to become quite resilient. In the short term, I agree 100% with you. On YouTube, Osla Creek also mentioned sewage. And actually, this is one that I'm kind of concerned about as well. You know, the minute you lose any kind of significant amount of power, or if the local water treatment plant shuts down, you could literally have a situation where a city like Calgary with 1 million people might not have access to basic sewage. And sewage is one of those things that you really don't want to mess with. So all of my clients get a bit of a talking to at the end, basically stating that they should have the ability to or have access to a bucket toilet and knowledge on how to use a composting toilet system. It's hopefully something that, I mean, if you're interested in that stuff, people that generally are interested in composting toilets are really interested in composting toilets. And then people that aren't interested in them hope that they never have to use one, probably because they've had bad experiences with privies or outhouses, which are horrible things that lack basic design. And that's a whole other conversation that we can talk about. But having the ability to compost your own waste in a situation like an outage is extremely valuable, and it can't be overstated. I think it's really, really valuable. If you're looking for a resource on composting toilets, I highly recommend the Humanure Handbook by John, is it John Jevons?
John Jenkins, yeah.
John Jenkins, yeah. Yeah, cool. Welcome back. The satellites came back up?
I don't know. There must have been a solar flare or something, knocked everything out for a couple minutes, but yep, we're back.
Yeah, so the next comment, in my 50 years in Alberta, I could probably count on one hand the number of hours I've experienced no electricity. This is amazing. However, my maritime relatives would have had a whole different point of view.
Yeah. I lived in Newfoundland for a year, and we spent, it was a week and a half without power one time. It was quite normal to miss 2 months of school every year because of the severe snowstorms.
But you know, that's the upside of down, though. I mean, if you're used to sorting out your problems on a regular basis like that, then it's no big deal. But when you have a society of individuals that expect it to be up in real time 100% of the time, the minute you take it away from them, the whole thing just goes into chaos.
Yep.
So before you left there, Dakota, you were talking about tree time and buffalo berry.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I kind of left off there, but I guess I'll just it's the Shepherdea argentea, or silver buffalo berry, is an incredibly adaptable plant. It's very drought tolerant, salt tolerant. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's an incredible pollinator plant. And a lot of native birds like the northern shrike and other kind of insectivorous birds rely on thorny shrubs for not only making their nests, but also for an integral part of their kind of strategy for storing food. They actually use them like root cellars or cold rooms, and that they'll go out and kill, grasshoppers and flies and things like that, and they'll impale them on these little spikes that are just part of the physiology of the.
Oh, looks like the internet went down for Dakota again there. So we're getting to the end of the call. I had one more question that I'm going to answer, and then if there's one other question, I can probably fit that in as well on this webinar. So the next question was, how do you insulate a 70s home? This is great. This should actually be a topic of a separate YouTube video or a blog potentially. And so what I can say about that is the 70s home is, or any home for that matter. I mean, when you're going to look at purchasing a home, there are certain characteristics that you want to look at with regards to whether the home is retrofittable. And number one, you want to look at how nice the inside of the house looks. So if the house doesn't look very nice from the inside, then it might be appropriate from an interior renovation. If the house needs updating from the outside and looks really nice on the inside, then you're probably going to want to go from the outside. However, it's really important to look at the size of the eaves associated with a specific house before you go and retrofit it. So you want your house to have sufficiently large eaves so that you've got room to basically expand the width of the wall if you're going to go out with insulation. Now, in addition to that, you're going to want to make sure, just going and adding insulation to the outside of a building is not necessarily a good idea without a little bit of forethought. You can end up creating a lot of mold problems if you do not contemplate where the vapor point or the condensation point is going to occur in the wall. So there is some design and careful planning that needs to go into just retrofitting a home. The new windows that are available today are absolutely incredible. So you can dramatically reduce the energy losses from windows, and insulating an attic is generally quite simple to do. One last thing to think about when you're going and purchasing a home is its aspect or orientation to south. So it's funny, in Calgary, there's very few houses that are properly oriented. When the city planners were planning the city, they obviously were planning it for different criteria, not access to solar energy. I do look at one other metric as well, which is the orientation of the roof. And so if you are going to put solar onto a roof, you want to have a roof that's going to have good access to southern sun. And then you'll also want to look to see if that roof is going to be shaded by neighbors, specifically neighbor trees. I anticipate that in the next decade, we're going to see an interesting form of law emerge, which is basically solar access law. So if your neighbor has a giant tree to the south of you, he or she may be required to remove that tree in order to give you access to solar energy on your roof. And it will be an interesting day when the government realizes that they're not getting any tax off of grid-based electricity, gasoline, and diesel as we start to move to an electrical economy, and the sun starts to be taxed. And it is coming, and I have kind of insider information on all of that stuff. Monica asks, what about insulating a 50s home? Same sort of thing. You're going to use the same criteria that we've talked about. So Marie from Newfoundland, regarding Marie from Newfoundland, I suspect, says, was that Newfoundland weather a reference to anti-fragility, Rob? Yes, absolutely. And so one of the best examples of anti-fragility, that was an example I gave earlier, was the concept of, this concept of the Russian Dasha system. How many people have heard about that? The Russian Dasha system was basically a system that was developed during the Soviet years where the government would allow individuals to have a plot of land somewhere in the country. And so this plot of land would be 1 to 3 acres. They'd be allowed to build a weekend home. And what's really interesting is because the Soviet system was really bad at producing food for its comrades, the people just learned to start to fend for themselves. And so it's kind of the upside of down. And what's really interesting about this is that it was that system that continued to function when the Soviet Union collapsed and ensured that almost everybody still had food to go around. So I think the Dasha system was responsible for producing close to 70% of the vegetables and 50% of the dairy and meat in the entire country during the Soviet era. And I believe it's still a culture that exists in Russia to this day. So there's always an upside to down. And North America is a society based around comfort and instant gratification. And that's all fine and great. It's a wonderful lifestyle to live until you end up not being able to live it anymore. And so one of the biggest risks I see outside of gas and electricity and all of these other things are actually people's sentiment to what they deserve, essentially. So in the event that a disruption does occur, the largest psychological shift, or the largest shift that's going to have to occur, is the psychological shift that you're going to have to make, that maybe you're not entitled to all the stuff that you think that you are, which is what the Russians had to go through when the Soviet Union collapsed. So folks in Newfoundland that are used to not having power for long periods of time have just slowly over time adapted to ensure that they have the right infrastructure and the right stores at any given time to make sure that they can make it through those prolonged periods without power. So we're getting to the end of the webinar, guys. I really appreciate everybody that signed in. And I just wanted to close out with a little statement. We're going to be actually starting, oh man, I think it's like our 25th permaculture design course starting on Thursday this week in Calgary. There's still a couple spaces left in that course if you're interested in joining. We're also heading out to Ontario next week. We're going to do our first permaculture design course in Ontario. If you know anybody in Alberta or Ontario that would benefit from the permaculture design course, please spread the word. I'm going to follow up with an email from this Q&A session. And I'd love to know what you thought about these webinars and Q&A sessions. We're contemplating running a whole series of them. And any feedback that you can provide would be really helpful. How to improve them, what subjects you might be interested in, and what you thought was great. So thanks so much, everybody. I know Dakota wishes you guys all the best, and I'm sure you'll see him on one of these webinars in the future. Have a fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.